and BSc in Agricultural Economics from White College, University of London. And if I go through his biodata, it's running into 13 pages. Sorry. So it's running into 13 pages, but briefly I will say that he has an expertise in agriculture and rural development, policy analysis, program design and implementation, rural enterprise development, non-farm rural economy and food security related issues. Then again, of course, the labor market and public investment in government programs, etc., and their impact. Now, he has done about 56 assignments till date. And he's and with, of course, with on behalf as a consultant or as an advisor, and at least in 25 countries, encompassing all these Arab countries, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, in Nepal, and I think by Bangladesh also. In India, he recently did consultant to, as a World Bank consultant to government of Himachal Pradesh to look into the issues related to marketing of horticultural products. And he has been associated, as I said, with not only World Bank, but UNDP, FAO, World Bank, EU, and UK. Now, his today's lecture, it is, I can say it is a gist of his experience of 14 years across the continents, and particularly in the developing countries. So that offers, a lot of insights to us. And the topic is that over-optimism in public policy. So, is it a right path for agricultural development, or it creates some kind of problems in agricultural development in terms of its negative externalities? A typical example, of course, in India, which we have been experiencing, the public policy made India self-sufficient in agriculture, in food security or food supplies. But that the excessive emphasis or over-optimism, what you call that has started resulting in some kind of natural negative externalities to the environment, to natural resources, and even the disparities, inter-regional and interpersonal disparities. He doesn't have a formal presentation, so he will be sharing his experience with us for about 40-45 minutes, and then if there is any very clarifications or questions, so you are most welcome. So Nick, it is your turn.
Dr. Battle, sir, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And I do commend you on making the best of visitors, because I agree. We are in our everyday work, we are sometimes failing occasionally to step back and to reflect on in our work. So I think a seminar series of this sort is an extremely good idea, and I was very glad to be invited. Let me say as well that it's a pleasure to be in a room full of agricultural economists again. I don't know when I was amongst so many agricultural economists. I think the last time was when I was a student, which was very, very many years ago. The opportunity to speak to a room full of agricultural economists is a very nice one. I often think that agricultural economists are the underappreciated part of the economist profession. So here is an opportunity for a little bit of solidarity amongst agricultural economists. And I very much welcome this opportunity. I used to be a university teacher for 10 years on agricultural policy. I then worked with international organizations for a long time, as Dr. Bethel said, for the EU, for a long period with the United Nations, and then more recently with the World Bank. And I am indeed here on an assignment for the World Bank, looking at the performance of agricultural extension systems in Assam, and asking specifically what elements of agricultural extension systems need to be strengthened for delivery of new technology under the World Bank assisted project in Assam, which focuses on rice and on vegetables. So that is the specifics of my assignment. But this is an opportunity, I think, to reflect a little bit on what we have perhaps learned in one specific aspect of agricultural development. And I would like to address what I called over-optimism in public policy in agriculture. Now, I think it's a surprise that this is a rather widely researched area. You might not imagine that over-optimism was the source of much analytical research, but it is. And a fairly cursory review of the literature shows that. In fact, the subject of over-optimism is most profoundly analyzed in a macroeconomic context. And there the studies, which include studies by the IMF, but also published in the Oxford Economic Review, those studies look at over-optimism in growth rate forecasts and in budget balances. Those studies consistently find that forecast growth rates and forecast budget balances are overestimated. In other words, governments present growth forecasts, particularly in the medium term, which are too high. They also present budget balances. This is internationally, of course, I'm not reflecting on India. They also make budget forecasts, which are too optimistic in terms of the budget balance. So we have a persistent tendency in macroeconomic forecasting to be over-optimistic, to see the picture as too favorable. Now, the implications in terms of budgetary resources, in terms of economic policy, are obvious if we are basing our policy on incorrect growth forecasts and on incorrect fiscal forecasts. Then, of course, we have a problem. But not only macroeconomic. We have a series of studies which look at poverty forecasts too. And those studies also find that poverty projections, the change in poverty, is over-optimistic. It finds that the expectations of poverty improvement are too high, are too favorable. That's perhaps not unexpected if the growth forecasts are also incorrect. If we're forecasting too high levels of growth, we're probably going to be forecasting too favorable. But what about at the microeconomic level? Of course, as agricultural economists, we're dealing mainly at the microeconomic level. What do we find there? There is an interesting study came out in 2021 on the effects of overconfident yield forecasting on crop insurance. And it found that consistently overconfident forecasts of yield change was having negative effects on take-up crop insurance. Farmers were looking at the forecasts, they were seeing what was expected in terms of yield changing, and farmers were either taking too little crop insurance or not taking crop insurance at all. In other words, we got the yield forecast wrong, we affected farmers' behavior in terms of their take-up of insurance. Farmers typically underinsured as a result. So a direct linkage between over-optimistic yield forecast and take-up of insurance products. So we have in agriculture an immediate indication that our forecasting ability is affecting income at the farm level. Now, numerous macroeconomic studies broadly coming to the same conclusion, rather less in terms of the microeconomic analysis. But I want to focus, please, on a report from the National Audit Office in my own country, the UK. Now, this is a rather old report. It was done 10 years ago, 2013, and it was called Overoptimism in Government Projects. The National Audit Office is a little bit like the Office of the Controller General, the Auditor General, but it has broader functions. It's not only an auditing and finance office, but it's also comments on the performance aspects of public expenditure, public investment and recurrent expenditures. So it looked at government projects over a period of some 5 to 10 years. And it came to a conclusion that perhaps we shouldn't find unexpected. It said most government projects do not deliver the anticipated benefits within the time and cost planned. It's perhaps not a terribly surprising conclusion, and I'm sure we have all had experience of that, but the generalization or the level of generalization was quite strong. To repeat, benefits were not delivered within the time and cost planned. It didn't say the benefits were not delivered, but the cost overrun and the time overrun was found in almost all cases. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that we are getting the planning of government projects wrong. Now, it didn't just stop there, thankfully. It looked at why this was, and it asked questions about why we so often get the planning wrong. And it came to the conclusion that there were 4 main reasons. Number 1 was complexity. It found that government projects were in the main much more complex than people had anticipated. That the nature of the change and the nature of the measures was a very complex equation. That government was trying to do something that was actually quite difficult to do. And remember, this is a comment on the UK government performance, but maybe we can generalize internationally. So complexity was the first barrier. People thought the planners thought the change could be achieved, but actually what what they were trying to do was difficult to do. Second, they found that the evidence base for what was planned was very weak. Or that the planners had not, in fact, referred adequately to the evidence base, that either the evidence wasn't there, or that the planners had not adequately taken into account the evidence base, or had not adequately analyzed it, and that statistical abilities in government were weak. I don't know how the Indian civil service is constructed, but the British civil service has been criticized for its lack of numeracy and lack of statistical skills. And so the processing of the evidence was often weak. The third diagnosis they gave was that reconciling the interests of multiple stakeholders proved very difficult. So in a government project, we have contractors, we have consultants, we have subnational authorities. We don't have state governments in the UK like you do, but we do have councils, which have nothing like the same level of powers that state governments have in India, but they do have powers. Then there was the voluntary bodies, the third sector, and there were normal, ordinary, everyday citizens. And reconciling those interests in the context of designing and implementing a project proved much more difficult than had been anticipated. And that frequent opposition from various bodies to change, as expressed through planning laws, appeals procedures, various bits of planning legislation, had prolonged change way beyond that being expected. In other words, the ability to bring together all bodies in consensus on what should be achieved was very difficult. And then finally, they talked about behavior and incentives. And they talked about bias towards optimism, which led government officials to underestimate the risks and to overstate the benefits. Now, I think we all know this. I'm certainly guilty of this. When we present a proposal, we want our proposal to succeed. We put the most positive spin on our proposal. We make it look good. We want to attract the funding. Our professional future depends in part on attracting that funding. We probably note the risks, but we don't overstress them, do we? We want to sell our proposal. We want to attract the funding. So there is an inbuilt incentive to overstate the case for what we're proposing and to understate the risks and the possible dangers. It's part of the process of winning funds. There was an interesting part in our discussion with Dr. Gautam yesterday, Dr. Berthold, where he said, securing funding is not a problem as long as you've got something new to offer. And that's really the point. Yes. We have to offer something new. We have to make it look attractive. We have to appeal to government to attract the funding. We cannot be realistic. Unfortunately, we cannot be realistic, because if we're realistic, maybe we don't get the money. Yeah. And that affects our careers. That affects our institution we work for. So we cannot always be the positive economists that we should be, the rational thinkers. We cannot always do that. We don't get the money if we do that. Now, why does this happen? There was another study by the UK Department of Transport in 2017, which looked at optimism bias, and it looked at groupthink, the tendency for everybody to think the same in an organization. And it looked at three reasons why we as planners, as economists, as researchers tend to be over-optimistic. Number one, what we call presentation bias. We want to project a positive image to other people. We want to suggest we have control over events, that we're able to present something that will be effective, that we know what we're doing. We know that what we're suggesting has value, has merit. So our self-presentation is an very important part of our professional being. If I stand up here, I want you to believe that I know what I'm talking about. I want to make you think that I'm an expert in the subject. I may not be an expert in the subject, but I want you to think I am. Second, we have what's called a confirmation bias. We look for the information that supports our case. We stress that information. We present information that supports the proposition that we are putting forward. And we probably understress the information that doesn't support our case, that argues against it. And then finally, there is what's called the I must do something bias. We cannot go back to the boss. We cannot go back to our manager who has presented us with an area to address and say, sir, we suggest doing nothing. We don't go back to our boss and say that. We can't go back to our boss and say that. Our careers are affected. Dr. Bertel, you presented me with an area for investigation. I suggest doing nothing. I don't think it happens. We are obliged to suggest some form of action. So it's the must do something bias in that action. All right, now I talked it in abstract terms. Let's focus on agriculture. Where does our over-optimism manifest there? I would suggest that our optimism over yield is universal. We tend to expect that farmers will achieve much higher levels of yield than they actually do. Why do we do that? Because we're taking yields that are achieved in research stations and yields which are achieved on demo plots. And we're saying farmers should achieve those yields. Now, some farmers will achieve those yields. Some farmers will apply the full extension factors. In my experience, no more than the top 20% of farmers. And the rest of the farmers will be distributed, the 80% will be distributed in terms of yield at some level below what is achieved on demo plots and in research stations. But when we plan our agricultural projects or our agricultural support, which yields do we use? We use the yields from demo plots and research stations. Typically, we do not use the field data if we have any field data. So I think, let me suggest that as agricultural economists, one of our most persistent areas of over-optimism is on yield. And I'm afraid I'm guilty of that too. I have been faulted on that. So I'm deeply conscious of that. The second area where we often hope for change and maybe don't achieve it is in cropping intensity. If we offer farmers irrigation, if we offer farmers extension advice on the ability to increase the cropping intensity, sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. Farmers, in my experience, do not typically increase their cropping intensity to the extent that we think they will. We know that if we offer farmers producing vegetables, if we offer them irrigation, they ought to be able to increase their cropping intensity. Again, some do, some don't. But the speed of transition in increase in crop intensity is usually slower than we expect. And the number of farmers who make the transition to a higher level of cropping intensity is also lower than we expect. So again, our planning is influenced by what we think farmers should achieve, not what they actually achieve in practice. Area number 3 is adoption rates. We must, in the design of our agricultural development actions, make assumptions about the speed of adoption and the number of farmers that adopt the extension packages. Now we have a problem here before we even get to measuring the level of adoption. And the problem is, and this is an interesting discussion we had yesterday, we don't have a measure of adoption. Despite 40, 50, 60 years of development, agricultural development experience, we do not have an agreed measure of adoption. Now, we have a problem, because if adoption involves a new variety, one or more types of fertilizer with sequential applications, different pesticides, a weeding regime, a ground preparation regime, how do we measure adoption? Is adoption exact following of all those measures? Is it measuring adoption within tolerances of those measures? Can we define partial adoption? In principle, there are different measures. We could choose one of the extension recommendations. We could focus on fertilizer and say we assume that if farmers follow the fertilizer recommendation, then they will probably follow the others. But we do not have a measure of adoption. So when we talk about adoption rates in agricultural development projects, we don't have an objective measure. But even if we did, we're probably over-optimistic about it. We assume rates of adoption, numbers of farmers adoption, and speed of adoption. In almost all those cases, I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that we are over-optimistic, that farmers change more slowly than we would expect. Some will never reach full adoption for reasons of cost, for reasons of weak extension. They don't see incentives to do so. But again, the rate of adoption, if we have a measure for it, is slower than we expect. And that has implications for the delivery, obviously, of the benefits. Next, cold storage. How often have you heard recommendations for cold storage? It is almost a universal panacea. We must have cold storage because of the seasonal fluctuation of fruit and vegetable prices. If we could have cold storage, we would benefit from the shoulder season prices, the out of season prices. We then make assumptions about the difference in price between the main season, shoulder season, and off season. And we make assumptions about the loss and deterioration rates in storage. Again, I have almost universally found over-optimism in those areas. In other words, the price benefits we get will be overestimated, and the loss and deterioration rates will be lower than are actually achieved, and other higher loss and deterioration rates occur in practice rather than in principle. And then finally, and here is I would be very interested to get your response on this. I find that almost universally, we assume that increased production locally will have no effect on price. That we assume that if we are successful in raising yield, in raising output, that despite that, there is no effect on price. In practice, I don't think that's the case. And quite small increases in local production have price effects, which obviously affect the farmers' gross margins. So a number of areas where habitually we, as agricultural economists, we either don't have information or a way of measuring change, or we are habitually over-optimistic in our assumptions, with impacts on the quality of our research and the impacts on the quality of project proposals that we might be formulating. Now, what do we do? What can we do about this? What we lack, I don't know if this is the case in India, but in most countries, we lack field data. We lack field data about yield in particular. I was working earlier, 2 years ago in Himachal Pradesh. I wanted field data on yields from new varieties of apples that had been planted in the past, which would guide the type of yields that were possible on the project. I couldn't get that data. I had expected to find it. I wanted to check whether the yields for the project proposal were realistic. I wanted to see data from farmers who previously planted those dwarfing rootstock varieties to see if those yields were realistic. I couldn't get it, which surprised me because I felt the yields on the project proposal were exaggerated, so I wanted to see field data to check that. So if we're looking at the expected performance of an agricultural support measure, if we're looking at the gains from a project proposal in agriculture, we at least need some field data to find out whether the yield expectations are realistic. And if we only did that one thing, then I think we would greatly improve our analysis. So if I could urge you, please, instead of focusing on research station or demo plot data, to focus on field data in yield. And that on its own, I think, would make a major difference to our analysis. On costing, we typically apply a contingency across the board in our costing of actions, say a 10% contingency to take account of physical and price effects. But what is happening in many, certainly my own country, is that there is differential contingencies applied in the areas where we know we habitually undercost. So instead of applying a universal 10% contingency in costing, we apply differential contingencies according to the areas where in the past we've seen undercosting. So that's on data. And then one final point on overcomplexity. I said that one of the reasons that diagnosed for the underperformance of government projects was overcomplexity. And that causes me to pose the question, is the value chain approach too complex? Think what we're doing in the value chain approach in agriculture. We're looking at production, we're looking at extension, we're looking at processing, we're looking at marketing, we might be looking at crop insurance and finance, we might be looking at weather forecasting. Is it too complicated? There's individually a set of very complex measures, which we have decided, thanks to Porter, who devised the value chain approach. He said, let's address all elements of the value chain. And we have adopted that in agriculture, but it's complicated. And if you don't get the primary production right, then the rest of the value chain approach makes no sense. In other words, if you don't raise production, then why are you concerning yourself with processing? If you don't change the output levels, why are you concerning yourself with changes in marketing? Thank you very much, sir. And I want to stop there, and I would be very happy to have reaction to the audience. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Great. Any questions, clarification, the section?
Was an excellent talk, Nick. I have one query, and I would also like to respond to your point on impact of local production on prices. So first is on regarding this over-optimism in public policies. So when we look at, when we talk about impact of any program, whether it is research or development program, so we have two kinds of approaches: ex-ante approach and ex-post approach. So when any stakeholder projects the benefits in ex-ante approach, he would either present a realistic scenario, or another at best he or she can take the optimistic scenario. But the over-optimism would come in the ex-post scenario. So do we have any threshold that how do we define over-optimism in any kind of policy decision, like, or policy variable parameter, whatever? So maybe price, productivity, growth, trade, any parameter. So do we have any threshold? So this is my basic query. Another thing, like you said that local production impacts prices or not, I would like to share my experience on onion. So when we take the case of India, particularly onion crop, we have major production clusters. So these are localized production belts. So whenever we have any change in local production, it actually impacts the prices. So the prices are, they are following the cyclical kind of approach, and when the negative kind of aberrations in production, they are impacting more. And all the prices, all the markets are linked, and price transmission is taking place. So the price is actually reaching to, but these impacts are percolating down to other markets as well. So the local production, it's actually impacting the prices.
Thank you. Yes. And thank you for the information about onions, because, and that's not unexpected, because I've seen the same things too. And the amount of change necessary to probably price change is probably rather less than we would imagine. But it's not very large amounts of increased production which lead to price change. Now, you raised an important question: what is an acceptable level of over-optimism, and what is an unacceptable level? And you're right that it takes place mainly at the ex-ante level that we wish to make a proposal which attracts funding. I also find that it takes place at the ex-post level when we come to the evaluation, because nobody wants to have their project criticized. So we might say that we are interested in robust evaluation, but the reality is probably not that we want to defend our project. Say, no, we did achieve. But what is the acceptable level? I don't know the answer to your question. It's an important role for us as economists to point out that the levels of change set out in an analysis or a project proposal or whatever are within realistic bounds. And I think it's the function that the economists serve. And we're an important counterweight to the biological scientists, because the biological scientists will say, this is the potential yield there, and this is what farmers will achieve. And almost a sort of not will achieve, they should achieve it if there were progressive, sensible farmers. But we know as economists that in fact, that the level of change, the real level of change is below that. So our function is to say, look, come on, this is what you're achieving in the demo plots. But if we look at farmers, what farmers are doing in the region, they're not achieving that, even if they're close to this general recommendation. So this is our problem level of estimate, not that. So if we have one valuable role as economists, it's to do that. It's a matter of judgment.
Anybody else?
Regarding this yield forecasting, so very difficult to understand that, this parameter of production will affect how much, because yield will come in future after 4 months, 6 months. So how this aviation in environments is really just complex will occur. And, moreover, the future experimental yield, I should say researchers lab yield. That is the maximum limit they define that this is the potential of yield in the tissue. And there is also demonstration plotting. And third is that what yield farmer gets at his own farm. Yield are. So realistic is farmer's yield. And demonstration yield is, yes, this can be achieved with available resources, available knowledge. Like this. But potential actual yield at farmers that laboratory level is difficult to achieve because n number of factors come in between and they affect it. So just to predict yield, it's very difficult. So regarding this ability of researchers to be limited, I would say there are some factors beyond the ability of researchers because data again same level. Data is missing. So without that data, things cannot be captured in present model. So again difficult. So whole problem lies around local yield data, local yield environment, everything from that look. That's why this is there. But once we are planning projects for funding, seeking funds, again we are going in a somewhat optimistic way because again we know the funding. So that's why this is the problem. This is some sorts of bias.
You're right. So there are three obvious reference points: both research station, development, and farmers here. Now, we are when we're making a proposal, the bias is there. We have to achieve certain levels of net present value or internal rate of return on our proposals in order to attract funding, particularly when we're dealing with international organizations. Now, one of the underrated tools in project analysis, I think, is sensitivity analysis. We have those three levels of yield. So we could ask, is our project viable at those three levels? Now, obviously, the financial economic analysis is going to be most favorable at the research station. It will be less favorable at the demo plot yield, and it will be even less favorable at the yield that we expect at the farm level. But when we're estimating the financial economic returns of the project, particularly obviously our starting point is the farm income analysis, then at least if we can use the three different levels in the analysis to show. And the most desirable situation, obviously, is the project still viable at the yield that we expect at the farm level? If it is, then I think we have the strongest case for the project. But if we're presenting our proposal on the basis of the research station yield, then reasonably our peers should say, come on, that is not what we look at. So sensitivity analysis is a very valuable tool.
About the kind of biases in projects, development projects, even in agriculture projects. So, as an economist, how to control the biases? Development projects.
I wish I knew.
So that we can read
I'm guilty too, you see, so that's the problem. Because of course I presented proposals for public dispute. I've come to the conclusion that the key is field data. That if we have field data, that anchors us in reality. We have also allowed, I'm afraid, the use of gross margins to fall into disuse. When I did my agricultural economics first degree, goodness knows how many years, one of the first things we looked at was gross margins. And there was there still is a handbook for gross margins in British agriculture. So if I want to find out the gross margin of winter wheat, I just go and look it up and it's updated. But in almost no country in the world can I arrive and find that the gross margin is not anything. So obviously yield is the major determinant of the gross margin, but it does allow us to bring into play obviously the input costs that we can count in the gross margin. So I think one of the most useful things that if you're not already doing it, and you may already be doing it, is an estimate of gross margins in agriculture, because that provides us for a reference point in our farming, and it stops us getting too wildly off track. So if we have field data and gross margins based on field data, we have the basis for a sensible farming analysis. But as I say, I'm guilty of bias. We have to.
Yeah, in data-rich environment, there's again there's the issue, but in data constrained environment.
I would not call India a data constrained environment.
No,
I don't call India a very data rich environment.
But for some of the crops, I think we don't have that kind of
Very low.
strong database, particularly for fruits and vegetables.
It's never going to be comprehensive, but I think India is better off than many countries. You have a very strong statistical system, and you have a strong statistical system in agriculture. The data is maybe there to a much greater extent than it is in many other countries.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. As you said, over-optimism is a sort of universal phenomenon. And we also see in India also like irrigation schemes are the large schemes. And we see huge cost and time overrun. And probably somewhere it may be an outcome of over-optimism in planning and those type of things. But I would like to know you that whether, if I could understand correctly your discussion, is it always talk in a negative sense that over-optimism is always a negative, or we do have some positive outcomes also, and we should rather see the net effect of over-optimism? For example, that Indian government made a target of doubling the farmer security. It's an optimistic decision, and it actually bears a lot of implication on a positive side. Over optimism can be said if the target was to be achieved in the short period of 50 years or 70 years or so. It could be the 10 years or something which they have planned in a realistic way. So we can say over optimism, but it actually changed a lot of things in Indian planning. We have directed from a transformation from production centric approach to income centric approach. And ultimately this over-optimism also sets a target so that maybe we cannot achieve 100%, but 70% or 80%. So can we see some positive aspects of over-optimism and go for the net effect? And the more danger is that suppose if we go the pessimistic way up or the most extreme sort of that. So information affects a lot of things. For example, as soon as we get the information of bad weather, your prices gets crashed, the stock market gets crashed, and those type of things. So which one may be the more desirable aspect in policy planning?
No, I see the point you're making to that, but I think one is a political statement, and one is an economic statement, isn't it? The doubling farm income is a very important political statement. which has unlocked actions and financing. I think the same was true of the Millennium Development Goals, which were an extremely optimistic statement, which possibly unlike the Sustainable Development Goals, which came later, were something that was appealing to a wide audience. Everybody could relate to the reduction in maternal mortality. Everybody could relate to the reduction in stifling waste. They were a very optimistic target, but they prompted governments into action because governments were afraid to be seen to be failing on the Millennium Development Goals. They were an exercise in almost extreme optimism, but it had beneficial effects. I think the problem, of course, comes for us as what should we call them? Economists have often been described in various derogatory terms. We're the dismal science. It is our job to be dismal, to be realistic about the measures that need to be taken, but also the costs and the actual rate of generation of benefits. So we're the counterweight in a way. If politicians can unlock the finance through setting strong political targets, we are the ones that need to bring in the realism in terms of the climate process. And when we are not realistic, then we are, as a economists, and unfortunately, in a number of areas, I think we owe ourselves some of the. So I think you set up a very interesting dichotomy: the strong political statement to unlock financing, the doubling farmers' income, the Millennium Development Goals. On the other hand, we as economists have to be the realists to show what can be achieved over what can be achieved.
Ms. Quaid, anybody else? So, well, friends, I think it was really a very, what I say, exciting talk and very interesting, particularly in the context of research on issues related to agriculture. And you have very rightly pointed out, sometimes the political statements without any appropriate feedback, evidence-based feedback, they lead to some kind of undesirable outcomes. So this is what is happening in our doubling farmers' income also. And I remember long back, sometime back, I read one. This historian. It is in the context of the export-led growth in the early 60s. So the Chinese president at that time, he asked that I want to double the exports of agricultural commodities. And so we have to double the agricultural food production. So the message percolated down from top to bottom at the village level. They say it can be increased by, say, at the most by 10% in 2 years. And it went at higher level, administrative level, even at block level or district level. It can be increased by, say, it is too less, it can be increased by 25%. Right, and it was almost double. And you know that there was a severe drought, famine in China at that time, when millions of people died out, that the government started exporting. So in that context, the thing is that there is some kind of disconnect between academia and policy, and that gives some kind of problems, because the bureaucrats, they are very good servants to their political masters, which the academia is not. It brings the truth on the table. Yes, this is the likely possibilities. At the most, with an error of 10%. So these are the things, but in that context now, of course, as he has written, the bureaucracy is immune to its own mistakes. So all, the thing problem, what your talk convey, the message to all of us, let's commit mistakes, but within a reasonable range. Given all those kind of, forecasts, so there are forecast errors. So all this kind of stuff, let's do, a fearful and good research to provide our evidences to the policymakers and others. And if not today, tomorrow they will realize it's value. So with this, I think it is a food for thought of also, because the reasons what he has put up, not related to agriculture, but particularly in the context of, over-optimisms, the complexities, as you said, that then poor evidence-based reconciliation of stakeholders, you cannot satisfy everyone, the needs. And then, of course, most important, the underestimation of risk and overestimation of benefits. So it happens. When I was at ICAR-NIAP at that time, the project proposal for funding used to be say, okay, the yield will increase by this level and it will reduce poverty by this level, which never happens. So those kind of over-optimism also we should avoid. With this, I thank Nick for your great lecture. Thank you so much. It is for your winter.
And I shall need it.